Scary, deep wood stories, whispers from the hollow. It started with a single scream that shattered the stillness of the night. The town of Wexley Hollow, tucked deep within the forests of northern Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of place where people screamed. It was the kind of place where silence was normal, where you could hear the leaves brushing each other in the wind or the owls whispering secrets from their perches. But when Sarah Kemp vanished, that silence was torn apart, and with it, the lives of the people in that forgotten town. She was 17, smart, well-liked, and fearless. The kind of girl who'd walk the trails at dusk alone, daring the darkness to show her its teeth. On October 12th, she walked into the woods behind her house and never came back. Her phone was found 2 days later, lying in the middle of a moss-covered clearing, still recording. The audio file was corrupted, but when the local tech guy managed to clean it up, everyone who listened to it regretted it. They said they heard whispers, hundreds of them, layered over each other in different languages and voices, some sounding human, some not. At the 4:02 mark, there was a sharp inhale, as if Sarah had just realized something horrific. Then came her scream, blood-curdling, desperate, and then silence. That was the last thing she ever recorded. Sheriff Nolan, a man who hadn't seen real trouble in years, organized search parties that combed the woods for a week. Drones were deployed, dogs sniffed everything, and yet the forest swallowed every clue. The place they called the Kemp Clearing became a cursed name. People started talking about old stories, things their grandparents warned them about. The hollow wasn't just a patch of trees, they said. It was a place with memory, hunger, and rules. Those rules had been forgotten, and Sarah was the price. Then the dream started. People in town, adults, children, even tourists, began waking up drenched in sweat, claiming they saw Sarah standing at the edge of the trees, her mouth open as if screaming, but no sound coming out. Others saw black shapes behind her, moving in unnatural ways. Some said they dreamed they were buried alive, with roots pushing through their mouths and eyes. It wasn't just paranoia. People began to act differently. James Wendell, the town librarian, set fire to every book in the folklore section and then disappeared into the woods. A week later, they found his teeth embedded in the bark of an old oak near the Kemp clearing. Just the teeth. No body. Dr. Eliza Harnett, the town psychologist, started a journal to document the rising hysteria. Her last entry was short. "The forest knows I've been watching it. I hear it whispering my name." She hung herself the next day in her office using a noose braided from vines. The vines weren't local. Botanists couldn't even identify the species. As fear gripped Wexley Hollow, a man named Marcus Delaney came to town. A tall, quiet outsider with a black duffel bag, he checked into the town's only motel and said he was a freelance investigator looking into Sarah's case. No one believed him. His eyes were too tired, his hands too steady. The motel clerk, a teenage boy named Drew, later told his friends that when Marcus checked in, his phone and watch both died instantly. Even the wall clock stopped ticking. "He brought something with him," Drew whispered one night around a campfire. "Or maybe something followed him here." Marcus began asking questions no one wanted to answer. He showed old photos from the 1800s, depicting gatherings near the forest's edge. People in ceremonial dress, their faces blank, their hands red with something dark. He talked about ancient cults, about rituals to keep the hollow satisfied. People laughed at first, nervous and dismissive. But then Marcus found something. Deep in the town archives, buried under layers of fake records and sealed files, he uncovered a letter written in 1873. It read, "The woods do not forgive. We promised a child every season. We lied. Now it watches." The paper was brittle, but the ink still bled like it was freshly written. That night, Marcus stood at the edge of Kemp Clearing, whispering into the wind. He didn't tell anyone what he said. But the next morning, a deer was found nailed to the front door of the sheriff's office. Its eyes removed, its mouth sewn shut with black thread. Sheriff Nolan resigned that afternoon, muttering something about the roots waking up. By the end of the month, 2 more teenagers had gone missing, twins Lily and Jacob Tresswell. Their parents found a note in Jacob's handwriting. "We heard her calling. We're going to bring her back." It was signed in blood. The town was unraveling. Churches were full, not with the devout, but with the terrified. Fires burned through the night, some for warmth, some as protection, and always just beyond the tree line, shadows waited. They never crossed into town, but they watched. People could feel them. Some even claimed they saw faces in the tree bark, mouths open in silent screams. Marcus began sleeping in shifts, a ritual dagger under his pillow and candles around his bed. He didn't tell anyone what he'd learned, but he started carving symbols into his arms, saying they were wards. The motel clerk walked in on him once during one of these carvings and passed out from the smell, not blood, but rot, like earth that had been disturbed for too long. It was clear Marcus wasn't just investigating, he was preparing for something. Then on the last day of November, Sarah's voice returned. Every phone in town received a voicemail at exactly 3 a.m. The message was only 4 seconds long, but it played on a loop for anyone who tried to delete it. Her voice, distorted and low, said one word: run. No one slept after that. No one could. The air itself began to feel heavy, charged with something unseen but deeply wrong. Birds stopped flying over the town. The wind no longer blew. And then, just as Marcus predicted, the ground began to open. Not all at once, just cracks at first, thin, jagged, and silent. But they spread fast like veins, and out of them came the whispers. Clearer now. Not just voices, but memories. Pain. Fear. The town of Wexley Hollow stood on cursed land, and its debt was long overdue. The cracks widened as days passed, splitting roads and creeping up the sides of buildings like black veins pulsing with something ancient and alive. The townsfolk stopped calling repairmen or complaining to City Hall. They knew the damage wasn't natural, not something that could be patched with asphalt or cement. At night, the whispers grew louder. They spoke in broken English, reversed syllables, and voices that mimicked the dead. One evening, Mary Tresswell, mother of the missing twins, stood on her porch and heard her children's laughter echoing from the tree line. When she ran into the woods, clutching her wedding ring in one hand and a flashlight in the other, her screams were heard by half the town. But by the time anyone found the courage to look for her, the only thing they discovered was her flashlight, still warm, stuck upright in the mud, and pointing toward a trail that hadn't been there before. Marcus Delaney knew the signs. He had seen them once before, in a town called Elms Ridge that had vanished overnight, swallowed by its own sins. The ground there had cracked too. The people whispered strange things, and those who stayed behind were never seen again. Only a few had escaped, and Marcus had followed their stories like breadcrumbs, always leading to places like Wexley Hollow, quiet towns with dark histories, where nature didn't behave and children vanished without a trace. Marcus sat in his motel room, the curtains drawn tight, candles flickering around a map of the town marked with black X's and red runes. He held a notebook in one hand, trembling slightly, and traced over a name he had circled 5 times. Ashford Lane. It had come up in a dozen reports, mentioned in old letters, whispered by those who'd lost family. Nobody lived there anymore. The houses were abandoned, reclaimed by vines and moss. The road cracked and barely passable. Locals called it a dead street, cursed, even before Sarah disappeared. According to town records, it was where the founding families once held their ceremonies. Marcus had to see it for himself. That night, while the town locked its doors and turned off its lights, he drove to Ashford Lane. The road was darker than the others, the trees thicker, arching overhead like fingers trying to block out the moonlight. As he stepped out of the car, the air grew colder, thick like wet wool. His flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but the houses emerged slowly from the shadows, rotting structures with shattered windows and doors hanging off their hinges. Then he saw it, the house at the end of the lane, older than the others, untouched by decay. Its paint was pristine, the windows unbroken, the front porch clean, as if someone still lived there. He stepped onto the porch, each footstep unnaturally loud. The door creaked open before he could touch it. Inside, the air was warm, unnaturally so, and filled with the scent of burned wood and lavender. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white portraits of families, none smiling, their eyes smudged out as if scratched away intentionally. As Marcus moved deeper into the house, he heard a soft humming coming from upstairs. It was a lullaby, one he vaguely remembered from his childhood. Something his mother used to sing before the shadows in their home drove her mad. He climbed the stairs slowly, the steps groaning beneath him, until he reached the master bedroom. The door opened on its own. Inside stood a little girl in a white dress, her back to him, humming the lullaby. "Sarah," he whispered. She stopped. Slowly she turned around. It was Sarah, her face pale, eyes sunken, lips cracked, but she was smiling. "You came," she said in a voice not hers. "It's time." Then the room changed. The walls melted away, revealing a forest that pulsed like a living thing. Roots burst through the floorboards, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. He fought, screamed, reached for his knife. But the forest laughed. Not in one voice, but in hundreds. He blacked out. When he woke, it was morning, and he was lying in the middle of the street. His clothes were torn, his arms covered in new carvings he didn't remember making. The symbols glowed faintly in the light. Townspeople gathered around, staring at him in silence. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew where he had been. They could smell it on him. The woods. That afternoon, a group of children playing near the Kemp clearing found a hole in the ground that hadn't been there before. It was perfectly round, lined with stones, and inside sat a book, bound in flesh, pages yellowed with age. Sheriff Nolan, who had returned briefly to pack his things, was called to inspect it. He opened the first page, read the first sentence, and then turned his gun on himself. No one touched the book after that. Marcus took it. He read it in his motel room with gloves on, candlelight flickering over the hideous script. It wasn't written in any language he knew, but he understood it. The book told of bargains made in blood, sacrifices offered to something beneath the hollow. Not a god, not a demon, something older, something forgotten. And it was waking. Every 50 years, the forest demanded renewal, life in exchange for silence. The last offering had been made in 1973. 50 years later, it was hungry again. Sarah hadn't been enough. The others were volunteers. It needed more. It needed a gatekeeper. The book described the process in horrific detail: the binding of flesh, the branding of the soul, the passage through the vein tunnel. Marcus knew he had no choice. Either he stopped it, or it would consume everything. That night, a storm rolled in from the north. Lightning forked through the sky, thunder shook the ground, and the townsfolk huddled in their homes, listening to the wind howl with voices that didn't belong. Marcus walked toward the forest with the book in one hand and a burning torch in the other. Behind him, others followed. Not all were from Wexley Hollow. Some had come from towns like Elmsridge. Survivors, hunters, keepers of secrets. The last line of the book had said, "Only in unity can the hollow be sealed. Only in sacrifice can it be silenced." As they entered the woods, the ground closed behind them. The trees shifted, welcoming them with open arms. And deep within the hollow, something smiled. The deeper Marcus and the others moved into the forest, the more the world twisted around them. Trees no longer stood still. They bent and leaned, creaking with an ancient language only the damned could understand. The air thickened, saturated with decay and wet earth, and the shadows behaved like sentient things, slithering across the undergrowth, even where light should have scorched them. Every step forward felt like a descent into time itself, a regression into something primitive and predatory. Behind Marcus walked 6 others, each carrying their own torment. Evelyn, the former librarian who'd been hearing voices in the book stacks for years. Jonah, a drifter who claimed he'd watched an entire town disappear overnight. Lydia and Sam, twin siblings whose grandmother was one of the original settlers and whose bloodline tied them to the rituals. Behind them came Pastor Caleb, a man who had lost his entire congregation in a fire he swore was divine punishment. And last was a boy no one knew, maybe 12, barefoot and silent, who had simply appeared the night before, standing outside Marcus's motel door with eyes too old for his face. The book pulsed with each step, vibrating like it had a heartbeat. Marcus could feel it through the gloves, feel it whispering to him, offering him things, promising salvation if he would just let go. But he held tight, knuckles white, jaw clenched. He couldn't let the forest win. Not again. Not like Elmsridge. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing where no sunlight dared fall. In its center stood a stone altar, covered in moss and old blood, ringed by 6 obelisks carved with symbols that defied known alphabets. The wind stilled. The forest held its breath. And then the ground split open. Roots exploded from the soil, forming an archway in the earth that led downward into utter blackness. One by one, the group stepped forward, guided not by courage but compulsion. The path beneath the hollow was unlike anything they had imagined. It was a tunnel of flesh and bark, the walls alive with movement. Eyes blinked in the roots, mouths opened and whispered secrets in lost tongues. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel pulsed, warm and damp, like being inside the rib cage of some great sleeping beast. Marcus led with the torch, which flickered and hissed against the moist air. The boy walked directly behind him, silent, eyes forward. No one had heard him speak, yet everyone felt his presence like a pressure on their chest. "We're being watched," Lydia murmured. But it wasn't just watching. The hollow was studying them, remembering them, uncoiling memories they had tried to bury. Sam collapsed suddenly, screaming as invisible forces ripped open his past, memories of his father drowning in the lake, pulled down by hands that weren't his own. Evelyn dropped to her knees, clutching her head, reliving the day she burned a forbidden book that wouldn't stop screaming. Pastor Caleb stood firm, praying under his breath until a voice answered in a mockery of scripture, twisting holy verses into threats. "This is where it begins," the boy said finally, his voice soft and cold. "This is where the hollow decides." The path ended at a massive chamber, a cathedral of bone and rot, where the ceiling dripped with black ichor and the walls trembled with breath. At the center stood a tree, gnarled and dead, but still bleeding sap as dark as oil. Embedded in its trunk were faces, screaming, crying, silent. Marcus recognized one. It was Mary Tresswell. Her eyes moved. She was still alive, just barely. The boy approached the tree and placed his hand on the bark. The entire chamber shook. Roots burst from the ground and seized the others. They didn't fight. They couldn't. The forest had them now. Only Marcus remained free, the book still in his hand. "You have to choose," the boy said, turning to him. "Sacrifice or surrender? Seal the hollow or feed it. There is no middle." Marcus's mind raced. The book had instructions, cryptic rituals about blood, fire, and memory. But he didn't know what would truly work. He glanced around, saw his companions being pulled toward the tree, their bodies melting into the bark, becoming one with it. He looked at the boy, who now had no shadow. "What are you?" Marcus asked. The boy smiled. "I am the echo of what was left behind. The hollow made me when it needed a voice. And if I seal it, then I die, and so do you." The choice was clear. To end the hollow, he would have to offer himself completely. Burn the book in the roots of the tree. Speak the words that would rip his soul from his body and seal the mouth of the earth. But could he? Was he strong enough? As the tree screamed and the chamber shook, Marcus ran toward the base, slicing open his palm and smearing blood across the book. He whispered the incantation, words he didn't understand but knew were true. The book caught fire, blue and green flames licking upward. The roots writhed. The boy screamed, his body cracking like porcelain. The tree shook violently, and then everything exploded into silence. Marcus stood in a void. No sound, no light, no pain, only stillness. He saw his life stretch before him, every moment, every loss, every failure. And then he saw the hollow, hungry, ancient, patient. "You cannot kill what was never born," it whispered. "You can only delay." With one final breath, Marcus spoke the last word in the book. His body disintegrated. The chamber collapsed. The forest screamed. In Wexley Hollow, the ground healed. The cracks vanished. The air lightened. Children laughed again, and the woods no longer whispered. But at the base of the old Ashford house, a new root pushed up through the porch. Tiny, innocent, waiting. Years passed. Wexley Hollow changed, as all places do when evil burrows deep, then goes dormant. The Ashford house, long abandoned after Marcus's final sacrifice, stood in the skeletal silence. A sun-bleached carcass with shattered windows and crooked steps. the kind of place teenagers dared each other to approach on drunken nights. The forest beyond it had grown strangely still. No bird song, no rustling wind, just a deep, oppressive quiet, like the trees were listening. But beneath the house, something had remained. A single root, dark and pulsing, coiled beneath the cracked floorboards, feeding on memory and dust, on whispered names and forgotten pain. And on the 79th anniversary of the fire that consumed the Tresswell farm, it bloomed. It was subtle at first. Crows began gathering in the trees. Dozens, then hundreds, their cries muffled as if swallowed by distance. Animals stopped crossing the dirt road that led into the woods. Lights flickered in homes, and dreams began to shift. People dreamed of fire, of hands clawing from the earth, of a boy with no eyes leading them down a tunnel of roots and blood. Among those dreamers was Clara Baines, a local school teacher and part-time historian who had taken a peculiar interest in Wexley Hollow's legends. She had read Marcus's journals, scattered pages found near the ruins of his motel room, and had quietly pieced together a timeline of unholy rituals, lost children, and a forest that fed on grief. Clara lived alone in a small bungalow at the edge of the woods, her windows facing the Ashford property. One night she awoke to find muddy footprints on her porch, small, child-sized, leading to her front door but not away. She cleaned them, brushed it off as a prank, but they returned, every night. Same pattern, same size. That's when the voices began. They didn't whisper in her ear or echo in her walls. They spoke from the corners of her memory, using the voices of people long dead. Her grandmother, her childhood friend who drowned when they were 12, even the voice of her unborn daughter lost in miscarriage. "Come back," they would say. "You know where we are." Clara knew. The Ashford house. Something was calling her, pulling her toward it with the gravity of dread. One rainy Saturday she gave in. Armed with her flashlight, journal, and a necklace her grandmother once told her could protect against the beckoning kind, Clara crossed into the overgrown path that led to Ashford Lane. The forest had changed again. Branches curved unnaturally, forming what looked like ribs overhead. The wind blew in bursts, always from behind, pushing her forward. She reached the house just as the rain stopped. Everything was damp, steaming, the air thick with rot. She stepped onto the porch. The boards moaned under her feet like they remembered weight and hated it. The door wasn't locked. It opened slowly, revealing a dark interior lit only by the gray light bleeding through cracked walls. Dust motes floated like ash, and there, in the center of the floor, was the root. It had grown since Marcus's death. No longer small, it was now thick as a man's leg, veined and wet, pulsing with a heartbeat of its own. Clara approached, entranced. She reached out to touch it, and the house screamed. Not a metaphorical scream. The actual walls shrieked as if in agony, nails bending, wood warping. The air turned electric, and Clara was no longer alone. A figure stood in the corner, just past the collapsed staircase. A boy, barefoot, face in shadow, wearing a tattered button-up shirt and pants several decades out of fashion. His eyes were hollow voids. "You remember," he said, voice like wind through bone. "You saw him in the pages. You read the warnings. You came anyway." Clara backed away, but her feet stuck to the floor, as if the house wanted her there. The root pulsed. "I wanted to understand," she whispered. "I didn't think—" "Understanding is what feeds it," the boy said. "Curiosity is the crack it slips through. That's how Marcus let it in. That's how I was made." He stepped forward and the room grew colder. Clara fumbled for her necklace, gripping it tightly. The boy paused, tilting his head. "That won't help. The hollow made you dream for a reason. You're next." With a sudden jerk, the root split open, revealing a hollow cavity inside, like a cocoon. And from within, something crawled out. It wasn't human. It had the shape of one, but its body was bark and bone, its face featureless, except for a mouth that stretched too wide. It stepped toward Clara, wet footprints blooming with mold. She turned to run, but the house wouldn't let her. Doors slammed, windows sealed. The boy watched silently as the creature opened its mouth, releasing a sound that wasn't a sound at all but a pressure, a vibration that made her ears bleed. She dropped to her knees, screaming. But then, silence. The creature stopped. The boy stepped between them. "Not yet," he whispered. "She must see." He raised his hand, and the walls of the house dissolved, revealing the hollow. Not as a tunnel, but as a memory. Clara saw the past, children chanting in circles, women crying over graves, Marcus bleeding into a book, fire devouring the forest, the tree with faces. And she saw the future, Ashford Lane swallowed by rot, Wexley Hollow emptied of life, the hollow stretching outward like a disease. "You can stop it," the boy said, "but only if you finish what Marcus started. Only if you choose." The creature retreated into the root. The vision ended. Clara was alone again. The house silent. The door open. She ran. That night she wrote everything in her journal, then mailed it to a post office box in another state. The address Marcus had circled in his final notes. She knew what she had to do. But first she had to find the book. It hadn't burned, not completely. Somewhere in the forest, in the place where Marcus died, the ashes still whispered. And the hollow waited, hungry. Clara Baines didn't sleep that night. The memory of the hollow's vision burned behind her eyelids, and every time she closed them, she saw the boy with the voided eyes and the root creature slithering from its cocoon. The images haunted her, but it was the voice that stayed with her, the boy's whisper, soft and steady. "You can stop it, but only if you choose." What choice did she have? Run? Pretend none of it was real? But the forest wouldn't let her forget. Every shadow that moved too quickly, every sound that rang a little too long, reminded her that something ancient and hungry had noticed her. And once the hollow noticed you, it didn't forget. The next morning, Clara packed supplies: water, flashlight, a digital recorder, her grandmother's necklace, a flare gun, and the journal she had written in feverishly the night before. Her plan wasn't fully formed, but she knew this much. If the hollow wanted her, she would go to it, but on her terms. Marcus's final notes had referenced a cabin deep in the woods, somewhere past Ashford Lane, beyond a stream that didn't exist on modern maps. He had called it the place where the book bled. If the never script, the grimoire Marcus once guarded, had survived, that's where it would be. Clara stepped into the woods just after dawn. The air was thick, heavy with dew and something else, an oily scent, like sap gone rancid. As she walked, the forest began to change. Trees twisted in impossible shapes, bark peeling like burnt flesh. Time lost meaning. Her watch stopped. Her phone turned black. The compass spun without rhythm. She walked for hours, or maybe days. There was no sun, only a dull, sickly light that filtered through the canopy like smoke. Then she heard the bells, faint at first, then louder, rhythmic. Not from metal, but from bone. She followed the sound until she reached the stream. It was thin, black as ink, and silent despite its movement. Across it stood a cabin, half swallowed by moss and vines, windows boarded shut, door cracked open like a mouth mid-scream. Clara crossed. The moment her foot touched the cabin's porch, the bells stopped. Everything stopped, even the wind. She pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with rot. Dust coated every surface. In the center of the room, on a pedestal of twisted wood and bone, sat the book, the never script, bound in skin, marked with the Tresswell sigil, an eye inside a hollow tree. As Clara stepped forward, the room darkened. The root was here too, coiling beneath the floor, pulsing with every step she took. The book called to her. When her hand touched the cover, her mind split. She saw Marcus, on his knees, whispering incantations, carving runes into his chest. She saw children, mouths sewn shut, eyes rolled back, suspended in midair by invisible vines. She saw the hollow's heart, a massive tree in a cavern of bone, roots reaching into every home, every dream, every forgotten place. And then she saw herself, holding the book, writing, bleeding, becoming. Clara ripped her hand away. The book throbbed. A voice echoed through the cabin. Not the boy's, not Marcus's, but something deeper. Older. Write your name. Begin the undoing. She backed away, heart pounding, but the door slammed shut. The cabin groaned. The root burst through the floor, wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, kicking, but it pulled her forward, toward the book. Her grandmother's necklace flared with heat. She tore it from her neck and pressed it against the root. It sizzled. The root recoiled, hissing like a snake. She lunged for the flare gun and fired into the pedestal. The book caught fire, but it didn't burn. It laughed, a sound like children crying underwater. The root writhed, the cabin shook. The book opened on its own. Pages turned rapidly until it stopped on a single phrase, written in Marcus's blood. "If you read this, it's too late." Clara ran. She didn't remember how she escaped, only that she awoke on her porch, clothes torn, feet muddy, and the book beside her, untouched by fire. She screamed and hurled it into the woods. It landed with a thud, then silence. For 2 days, Clara didn't move. She locked her doors, boarded her windows. The book returned the next morning, sitting on her kitchen table, open, blank, waiting. That night, the dreams returned, stronger, darker. She saw her students hanging from the trees outside the school, their mouths open in eternal screams. She saw her dead daughter standing in the hallway, pointing toward the woods. "Finish what he started," the voice whispered. "Write the names, feed the hollow, or watch it grow." Clara realized the book didn't want a spell. It wanted a story, a history written in pain, memory, and blood. A scripture of sorrow, and she would be its author, or its victim. She made a choice. She drove to the library, broke in, scanned every record, every file, every forgotten diary. She built a list, those who had vanished near Ashford Lane, their names, their stories. She began writing them into the never script, each name costing her a piece of herself. Her hand shook, her nose bled, but she kept going. With every name, the forest groaned. Roots recoiled. The dreams grew quiet, until she reached the last name, her own. The page remained blank. The pen hovered. "To end it, you must finish it." She wrote, Clara Baines. The lights flickered. The air turned still. The root burst through her floor again. But this time, it didn't reach for her. It withered, crumbled. The book snapped shut. Silence. For the first time in months, she slept without dreaming. The hollow, it seemed, had been fed, or fooled. She buried the book beneath a stone altar deep in the woods, sealing it with runes and salt, and she prayed it would stay buried. But that night, as she sat on her porch, sipping tea, something rustled in the trees. A boy's voice called out, "Thank you, Clara, but it's never really gone. It just sleeps." And from beneath the ground, a faint pulse began again. The morning after Clara buried the never script, the forest stood still in a way that felt more like a held breath than peace. The air was clearer, the fog had lifted, and for a moment Clara allowed herself to believe it was truly over. She cleaned her home, opened her windows, and burned every journal entry she had written about the hollow. The flames devoured the ink quickly, as if the words themselves wanted to disappear. But even as she poured coffee and stared out toward the woods, unease clung to her. Her dog, Mabel, wouldn't go outside. The birds, once cautiously returning, had gone silent again. That afternoon, the phone rang, a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. It was Sheriff Weller. There had been another disappearance. A group of teenagers from the neighboring county had been camping near Ashford Lane. Their tents were found shredded, their gear untouched, their footprints ending in a circle of blackened earth. Clara dropped the receiver. She hadn't written their names. The book should have been asleep, unless something or someone was still feeding it. That night, Clara returned to the altar in the woods. The stone slab had been cracked, dirt pushed upward from beneath as if something had crawled out. The never script was gone. Panic slammed into her like a wave. She searched the forest floor, calling into the dark, until a voice, familiar and cruel, answered. "Clara!" She turned. It was Marcus, or what used to be him. His face was half-rotted, eyes glowing faintly like coal and snow. His chest was marked with deep pulsing sigils. In his hand, the book. "You thought it needed you," he rasped, "but the hollow was never yours to end, only mine to serve." She stepped back. "You're dead." "Death," he said, is a doorway in the hollow. From behind him came others, dozens, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes vacant, all marked by the book. "What do you want?" Clara whispered. "The last chapter," Marcus said. "The hollow wants its harvest." She ran. She didn't remember how far or how long. Just the sound of feet behind her, silent, countless. At the edge of her property, she tripped, fell hard, and as she scrambled up, she saw a shadow move across her window inside the house. They were already there. Clara barricaded herself inside the cellar, candles flickering around her. She listened to the creaking floors above, whispers leaking through the wood. Her name, over and over. They were calling her to write again. But the book wasn't with her. It was with him, and somehow it was still using her. She realized then the book didn't need to be near. Once you touched it, once you wrote in it, you became part of it. Your story fed the hollow whether you wanted it to or not. Clara thought of fire, of salt, of rituals her grandmother had taught in whispers. She remembered the old map tucked in the back of the church, the one that marked the ancient burial grounds beneath the hollow. She had always thought them symbolic. Now they might be the key. She waited until the house fell quiet again, until the whispers stopped. And then she moved. She broke through the boarded cellar window and ran across the field to the abandoned chapel. The doors groaned open. Inside, the altar was untouched, the air thick with incense and mildew. Behind the altar was the door to the crypt. She descended. The air grew colder, the walls tighter. At the bottom were bones, countless, scattered and broken. But in the center was a hollow tree stump, dead for centuries, but still warm. She knelt beside it, pressing her hand to the bark. It pulsed. She remembered the root, how it had burned when touched with her grandmother's necklace. She pulled the chain from her pocket and plunged it into the center of the stump. A scream, not hers, filled the crypt. The bones rattled. The ground shook. The air twisted. Light erupted from the chain, searing the wood, and in that moment, Clara saw through the hollow's eyes. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a mouth, and the book was the key. The roots fed it. The name sustained it. But the tree, that ancient stump, was its heart. If she destroyed it, maybe she could starve it. The scream rose again, louder, closer. The stump cracked. Blood, thick and black, oozed from the bark. Clara grabbed a rusted blade from the altar and plunged it into the stump. Once, twice, again. The scream fractured into 1,000 smaller ones. The floor caved. She fell into darkness. When she awoke, she was back in the woods, but they were different, silent, empty, dead. The trees had no leaves. The roots were brittle. The path home had vanished. She was somewhere else, a version of the hollow that existed beneath, where things went when they were forgotten, a place beyond death. The book hovered before her, open, its pages glowing. It showed her images, the children, Marcus, the lost, all trapped, all unfinished stories. "Write," the voices said. "Finish us." Clara understood. The book never wanted her life. It wanted her story, her truth, her pain, and in return, it would show her everything. She picked up the pen that hovered midair. It bled ink before touching the page. She wrote for hours, days, maybe longer. And with each name she remembered, each memory she poured, a soul was freed. A scream fell silent. The hollow weakened. But when she reached the last name, Marcus, she paused. She saw him, trapped, twisted, beyond saving. He looked at her, not with hatred, but sorrow. "I wanted to protect it," he said. "I failed." She wrote his name anyway. And as she did, the book closed. The forest began to heal. Green returned. Light pierced the sky. The hollow exhaled. Clara awoke at her desk, the morning sun warm on her face. The book was gone. Her hands were clean. Her name was no longer etched in the root. She was free, or so she thought. That night her phone rang again, a child's voice whispering, "You finished their story, but what about yours?" And from under her bed, the sound of pages turning. The voice on the phone haunted Clara long after the line went dead. its childlike whisper curling into the corners of her mind like smoke that refused to disperse. You finished their story, but what about yours? The words echoed as if etched into the walls of her home. She paced the living room with the phone still clutched in her hand. But no matter how many times she redialed the last number, all she heard was silence, broken only by the sound of static hissing faintly, like distant wind howling through trees that weren't supposed to be there anymore. Clara told herself it was trauma, a lingering echo of everything she had endured, a ghost of her own mind trying to stitch itself back together after tearing so violently apart. But when she bent down to pick up the pen that had rolled under her desk, she found a trail of black ink droplets leading from the baseboard toward her bedroom, as if something, or someone, had dragged a quill soaked in that cursed blood ink across her floor. The air was cold again, unnaturally so, like the warmth of sunlight earlier had only been a dream. That night, unable to sleep, Clara placed a recorder beside her bed, desperate to prove to herself that the whispers were just imagined. But the recording the next morning chilled her to the bone. There were footsteps, bare, shuffling on the wooden floor. Her name whispered slowly by multiple voices in perfect sync, and the unmistakable sound of a page turning every 60 seconds. Clara tore apart the room, lifting her mattress, yanking drawers from their tracks, pulling clothing from the closet until her room looked like a storm had passed through. Then she saw it. Beneath the floorboards, one had been slightly lifted at the corner, splinters loose like something had forced its way up. Her heart thudded as she pried it open. Inside was a narrow tunnel, impossibly dark, with claw marks scratched into the earth walls and ink stains smeared along its path. She should have sealed it and run, but curiosity, the same cursed drive that had brought her to the hollow in the first place, pulled her down. She descended on hands and knees, the tunnel barely wide enough to crawl. The air grew humid and metallic. The deeper she went, the louder the whispers became. Not with her ears, but in her head. They recited names. Some she knew, most she didn't. All lost, all unfinished. The tunnel opened into a chamber. Its walls were made of stacked pages, some bleeding ink as if they were alive. In the center stood a desk made of black stone, and on that desk the book, whole again. Rebound in human leather, its spine stitched with thread still damp. Clara backed away, trembling. "No," she whispered, but the book flipped open. Her name was there. Clara Monroe. Below it, blank lines waiting to be filled. Then a familiar voice. "You're not done, Clara." It was her grandmother's voice. But when she turned, it wasn't her grandmother. It was the girl from the mirror. The one she had seen all those weeks ago. The one with stitched eyes and ink leaking from her mouth. "You freed their stories," the girl hissed. "But you forgot one. Yours." Clara screamed and ran, but the tunnel had changed. It twisted and turned back in on itself, always leading her back to the chamber. She stumbled, scraping her hands on jagged words that bled from the walls. The book waited, patient and open. "Write," the voices commanded, "or be written." Clara knew then that this was the price. You don't just take from the hollow, you give. You give everything. She fell to her knees, hand trembling as she picked up the quill that had appeared beside the book. The ink writhed at its tip like it was alive. Her memories poured out uncontrollably. Visions of her childhood, her first nightmare, the day she found her grandmother hanging from the tree with pages sewn to her skin. It all spilled across the pages without her will. The ink crawled across the parchment like vines, binding her past, rewriting it. She tried to stop, but the quill wouldn't let go. Every resistance only caused pain. Physical, sharp, searing pain that slashed across her arms and legs like phantom blades. Then a new voice came, one she hadn't heard before. It was young, male, frightened. "Clara, help me," it cried. She turned and saw a boy in the corner of the chamber, bound by ink vines, his mouth sewn shut with barbed thread. It was Benji, the missing boy from the camping group. His eyes were filled with terror. Clara dropped the quill. "How do I stop this?" she screamed. The voices laughed, overlapping in hideous harmony. "Write the ending." She lunged toward Benji and tried to pull him free, but the vines burned her skin on contact. The boy's body shimmered and flickered like static, as if he wasn't entirely real, like he existed in another layer of reality. The book behind her slammed shut. The chamber trembled. The walls cracked, and ink poured from the ceiling like a flood. Clara grabbed Benji and pulled with all her might. With a scream that tore her throat raw, she broke the vines. The boy collapsed into her arms. "Go," she whispered. "Run!" But he didn't move. His eyes rolled back. His skin bubbled. He convulsed, and then he was gone, turned to ash in her hands. The book opened again. A new line appeared. Benjamin Cade, story incomplete. Clara backed into the corner, sobbing, her hands stained with soot and ink. The pages on the walls rustled. "Finish us," they cried, "or take their place." She understood now. The hollow was insatiable. It consumed not just the dead, but the stories left untold, the unfinished thoughts, the dreams, the pain, the secrets, and it was never done. As long as there were names, the book would need writers, and Clara was next. Clara stood frozen in the ink-soaked chamber, her breath ragged, her body trembling from the weight of what she had witnessed. The ashes of Benji still clung to her fingers, warm as if his soul had only moments ago evaporated into the air. The book remained open on the stone pedestal, its pages flipping on their own. Names scrawled across them in bleeding ink, some scratched out violently, others simply incomplete. Every name held a story, a soul trapped between silence and remembrance. And Clara realized then that the hollow did not simply consume the dead. It fed on the unfinished, on the unresolved echoes that haunted every human heart. A faint hissing sound drew her attention upward as the ink dripping from the ceiling ceased and was replaced by something else. Smoke. Not thick, gray smoke like firewood, but something darker, oily, writhing with movement as though it were alive. It poured downward in strands, curling toward her like fingers. Clara turned and ran, her feet slipping in the slick ink that coated the chamber floor. She dove into the tunnel, scrambling back the way she came, her hands scraping against jagged root and splintered bone embedded in the walls. The smoke chased her, whispering names in 1,000 different voices, some screaming, others pleading, all overlapping in a chaotic storm of suffering. "Clara, Clara, Clara," they chanted, the sound growing louder until it drowned out her own thoughts. Just as she felt the smoke begin to crawl across her back like cold fire, she burst into her bedroom, toppling forward and landing hard on the wooden floor. The trapdoor slammed shut behind her on its own, the sound echoing through the house like a final sentence. For a long moment, she lay there gasping, covered in ink, blood, and sweat. But she was out. The chamber was gone. The book was buried again. Or so she thought. When she finally stood and turned around, she found her bedroom changed. The walls were no longer clean. Handprints in soot and ink smeared the plaster, and words, thousands of them, had been carved into the surfaces, overlapping each other in chaos. They were sentences, fragments, bits of memories, all familiar yet foreign. One near the window read, "He never came home." Another, "She was in the closet the whole time." And another, "The mirror showed her tomorrow's corpse." They were stories, stories unfinished, stories waiting. In the center of her bed sat the book, closed, but with her name etched now not on the first page, but the cover, burned into the leather, Clara Monroe, property of the hollow. Her legs buckled. She dropped to the floor, her mind unraveling as she realized the horror she'd brought back. This wasn't just about the cabin. It had followed her. The hollow was mobile. It attached to people, not places. Her body became the new threshold. And every story she had ever tried to tell had become a thread leading straight to its heart. A knock echoed through the house. Then another. Then 3 more. Clara crawled to the window and peeked outside. Figures stood along the tree line, dozens of them, unmoving. Some missing limbs, others glowing faintly in the darkness, like embers under skin. The door creaked. Clara screamed and slammed it shut, locking the deadbolt, then ran to every window, every entry, securing them. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved with intelligence, one knock after another, always rhythmic, always in sets of 7, a pattern, a code. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, a flashlight in one hand and the recorder in the other. Hours passed. The knocking continued. And then, at 3:07 a.m., the air turned still. The silence was thicker than the noise. The recorder hissed, and a voice, her own voice, played back. "He's already inside." Clara dropped the device as footsteps echoed from the hallway. Slow, bare, wet. She rose to her feet and backed away as a figure emerged. Her grandmother, but not as she remembered her. The skin sagged and peeled in places. Her eyes stitched shut with thread made of hair. Her lips curled in a grotesque smile that split her face in unnatural angles. "You opened it," the creature hissed in her grandmother's voice. "Now it must be fed." Clara ran. She bolted into the bathroom, slammed the door, and held it shut with her entire weight. The thing knocked gently. "Finish the story," it whispered. "Finish them, or be one." Then silence. When she opened the door again, the hallway was empty. But the walls were not. Dozens of faces had been painted in ink across the wallpaper. Each bore a look of agony. Each blinked. They were watching her, waiting. Clara packed a bag, left the house, and drove until the sun rose behind her. She didn't stop for hours until the gas gauge screamed empty. She found a motel on the edge of a dusty highway, the kind where no one asked questions. She checked in under a false name. Room 6. The air smelled of mildew and rot, but she didn't care. She laid on the bed exhausted, eyes burning. And there, on the nightstand, lay the book. She hadn't brought it, but it was there. Open, her name in ink, and below it a new line being written slowly before her eyes. She tried to run, but you can't outrun the hollow. She backed away, heart pounding, and tried to burn the book. She doused it in lighter fluid and lit the match. The flames erupted, but the book remained untouched, laughing at her in the voices of everyone she'd ever known. And then it opened again. A picture formed across the pages. Her, in that very room, at that very moment, with a shadow behind her. She turned just in time to see the figure reach for her, tall, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. She screamed, but her voice was snatched from her throat before it could leave her mouth. She fell into darkness, the pages folding around her like wings. And then silence. The motel manager swore no one had checked into room 6, said it had been vacant for months, but the cleaning staff refused to enter, said there were whispers at night, said the mirror always showed 2 people, even when the room was empty, and the book, still there on the nightstand, waiting for the next name, waiting for the next story.